Hello, everybody. Bob Schlenker here, The Open Scroll with Aaron Herman.
Hi, everybody.
And what we've got for you today is not one of those three-part formats because we're going to address a passage of Scripture, and that's going to be the whole of our study. There's a lot there. So I don't think you'll be disappointed. In fact, why don't you go get your dancing shoes because you're going to want to put them on and join us. Okay, so on screen, I've got the pending reset of time, the essential guide, which I want to introduce right up front because this sets some context for what we're going to get into. And I'm going to be returning to it because we're going to describe something that is supporting this model that you see in this graphic. So a little while back, Sister Valentina sent us an email, and she said that she thought this had the keystone pattern in it, and she was certainly right. It does. So, Aaron, would you read from verse 1 of Ezekiel chapter 47 in the ESV through to the end of verse 6, please?
Certainly. Ezekiel 47, verse 1. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by the way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits, and then led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again, he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again, he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again, he measured 1,000, and it was a river I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river.
So the keystone pattern is three things of a kind and then a fourth thing in basic principle. And I'll explain a little bit more, but basically we see here that this man measured 1,000 cubits, then led John, the witness here, through the water, and it was ankle deep. And then it repeats. Again, he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. And then that's the second time. And then the third time here, again, he measured 1,000 and he led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Now for the fourth time, again, he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. So the fourth thing is similar to the three that came before it, but there's something that's significantly different. Where before, you could wade through, you could ford, you could stand in it, no problem. But in the fourth, after the 4,000 marker, it was a river that could not be passed through, the deep water. So that fits the keystone pattern. And the significance of this will be really multiplied by the other elements that we'll see that we're going to talk about in here. But if you're new here, the keystone pattern is very significant because it tells us where we are in time. It has to do with the accounting of the Lord's calendar and his return, the season of his return in judgment, and it's a season that extends from the point of a celestial sign that came in 1991, and it involves a particular 7 years of time known as the Shemitah, where the resurrections are going to be fulfilled and other events that are pictured popularly in the book of Revelation. So how do we know when those events are going to happen? Well, it's because of the way that the Lord accounts his calendar, and he hid these things and he reveals them. And it has to do with the accounting that's typical on the Lord's calendar, where you have a celestial sign and then that signals the beginning of a count. And the count toward the particular Shemitah is according to this keystone pattern. I call it a keystone because it locks two things together. And what's locked together is the celestial sign of 1991, which is represented by this line on the left-hand side of this graphic, and this Shemitah over here that's got a number 4 on it. 3 things will pass that are the same, and then the 4th thing, which is similar but different, is going to happen. And you'll notice here there are 2, one behind the other, both of them having the number 4, and that's because this 4 Shemitah, which we're in right now, is going to be repeated. Not exactly, but over the same calendar years. And there's a reason for that. And the correct biblical calendar demands that this pattern of these 4 things happens. But we needed the insertion of another 7. This is how we've come to understand it, because of the way that the Lord revealed it and because of the many biblical scenarios that are prophetic allegories. And we're going to see one of those. And it's one that Aaron and I are really excited about. And it's one that we just cannot help but to be excited about because it's awesome. It's very rich. Yesterday, when I was working through this, I put this together. And if you've never seen this before, let me describe this. This is Ezekiel 47. It's the text of the Bible going from verse to verse. And I've got it included through the end of verse 17 here. And what I've done that's kind of unique is I've made line breaks that are different from just verse to verse. Some of them are representing verses that are fairly complete in a section, but some of these sections are multiple lines per verse. And the reason why I've put them together this way is because the Bible language is highly structured. It's highly ordered. And when you look at the themes, you find a repetition of themes. The language of the Bible isn't repetitive for the sake of prose or poetry. It's repetitive because there's a pattern that's inherent in all God's creation, including his word. And this pattern, like the rest of creation, when we study it, it will inform us about certain things. So God has provided another layer of information. And those of you who know about encryption would consider this as steganography because it's concealing information in a way that's not immediately apparent. But when you understand what's going on, it's a great tool to use with thematic structure analysis to discern another layer of truth. So what we're primarily interested in here is in this section from verse 3 through 5. And here you see verses 3 through 5, including verse 6, right in this section right here. You see this bar has got a little different design to it, which the cursor turns to a hand, and when I click on it, it brings up this little window that I can drag around. It allows me to embed a context appropriate note. It says the keystone pattern, 3 of a kind, followed by a 4th of the same kind, but yet distinctly different. So in this, we have quite a layer of the keystone pattern that's very dramatic. And within that and surrounding that, there's a context of time and the flow of time and the fulfillment of things that God has promised. And Well, there's a lot going on here. Number one, we talk about water as time. We talk about that metaphor because it's in the Bible and it's in media. It's resonating all over the place. Water as time is a very fundamental metaphor. Aaron and I really first caught on to the importance of it, which had to have been hidden from us for a long time. But he had was it a dream or a vision?
It was a dream.
A dream. And the dream has been very fruitful for us. It gave us a show of arc numbering signs that were discerned because of that dream. There's been some other things with regard to that dream, which we put out on the blog. And the fruit of that continues to be brought forth. And the water as time metaphor isn't really a big secret. A lot of people know about that. But when it comes to the Bible, most people just don't know because it's been hidden. But we have been talking about this for a while, and we see it over and over and over again, and that factors in here in a big way. And one of the other things we talk about is the temple at the center of time, which is something that it's the title of a book that was put out by researcher and brother in Christ David Flynn, and he, based on the work of Isaac Newton and his studies of many things, David Flynn came to the conclusion that there was something going on with the location of the temple that related to the expression of time and how events on Earth were marked out on the globe according to a distance time correlation. So if you take a compass and you put one end of it where the Ark of the Covenant was on the mount in Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, Mount Zion, really, if you extend that according to a certain ratio, 1-to-1, you will have where Old Testament events happened on the scale of statute miles, 1-to-1, and you'll have New Testament events according to nautical miles. And according to this formula, you can obtain some very, very interesting insights. So the temple at the center of time is a construct that the Lord has magnified to Aaron and I in our studies several times. And it's been very essential in our understanding of what was going on in 2012. Because the Olympic Park was mapped out and related exactly according to the season of Israel's becoming a nation, which didn't happen in a day. It happened over a season when the announcement came that Israel was going to be a nation, and then it was finalized after a season of trial, basically. So the correspondence was one proof to us of the relevance of the temple at the center of time. One of the other items in the background here has to do with Hezekiah. With regard to the reset of time, we look back to what happened as a sign to Hezekiah that God would extend his life by 15 years. And this sign was discussed in 2 places in the Bible because it's really that important. And it had to do with the sign of the sun and the sun's shadow going back 10 degrees on what's known in some translations as steps, but it's also the degrees of the sundial of Ahaz. And so time went backwards. Time was reset into the past as a sign. And then what Hezekiah was renowned for is subsequent to that sign, while he had the extension on his life, he tunneled through the Temple Mount, through the rock under the Temple Mount, and he was famous for that. And the reason why that's significant is because this is redirecting water under the Temple Mount, which is water as time under the temple at the center of time. And what he was really renowned for wasn't just his geological expertise, his tunneling expertise. It was the redirection of the water as time. And so that's very relevant. And what we see here in Ezekiel is pretty extraordinary. It continues on. Chapter 47 is a continuing of what was happening in the chapters before. But as Ezekiel is getting a tour and watching these things happen, this is time-space ritual. This is prophetic. You can't really take that as anything other than that. It can't be considered as being a teaching about how we're supposed to behave, or a story about just something that was done that is inspiring in some particular way. This is a time-space ritual that's being performed for the sake of prophecy. So what does it mean? Well, we believe we know. We think you will too. So because the keystone pattern is in there, we understand that this is really for us now. And you'll see some things in the way this unfolds that are pretty exciting. But in this ritual, it begins, and I'm going to talk about the structure of this first part here. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple. To go back, you had to have been there before. So they've done a circuit. They've done a full circuit. They've closed the loop. They're back at the door of the temple. And behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. Okay, water issuing from below the threshold of the temple. It's sprung a leak. What is this? This is time flowing from the temple at the center of time toward the east. Now, the word east, let's go to verse 1 here. Water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east. Kadum. We talked about this in Judges 5, how it was linked to Star Wars, fighting on from their base of the Stargate through dimensional warfare. And so this word has to do with location, and it has to do with a temporal theme. So toward the east, you can certainly interpret it toward the east, and that's quite relevant. But you have to understand that there is a temporal aspect to this. Like in Judges 5, the same word has a temporal layer. Temporal meaning time. The temple at the center of time. So, toward the east. So this is the time associated water flowing. And the temple faced east. It is a temple at the center of time, and the temple alignment is significant. It faces east. Now, if you know your prophecy, the Messiah is going to come to the temple. He's going to come from the east. This is the direction where he's coming from. So it's facing, there's an alignment with the Messiah. The Messiah's feet are going to touch on the Mount of Olives. The mount's going to split, and there's going to be water. So I repeat about the water flowing here as part of verse 1. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. So we've got a inner gate apparently and an outer gate, and we've got more water. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. So this must be maybe on the south side of the east gate. So what is the point of giving these directions? Well, you have to kind of diagram this to see what's going on. This is putting in our mind, okay, visually to conceive of this, what's going on. There's some kind of ritual that's mapping out inside and around the temple. And there's a point to that. It's not just trying to fill up space with technical detail. It's not what's going on here. But even in this language, there's a structure. Then he brought me, then he brought me. See the repetition there? I highlight both of these so that we see that. This first part of verse 1 is matched and repeated in verse 2. Verse 1 and verse 2 are both in two parts. This is what you'd call an A prime, B prime construction, and that just describes the basic structure. So it's pretty obvious. Down here, we've got something else going on, and part of it is pretty obvious, and part of it gets awesome. Well, the obvious part's awesome too, but here we go. So in this first bar area here, I hover over it and I highlight the companion pieces to it, the three that are alike. And this fourth one is like it too, but I haven't combined it with the other three because I'm drawing attention to how these three are the same. So going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits. Verse 4, again he measured 1,000. Again he measured 1,000. Verse 5, in the fourth part, again he measured 1,000. It's the same in each one 4 times. Then in the next set, and then he led me through the water, and he led me through the water, and led me through the water. And then down here, in the fourth part, then he led me back to the bank of the river. So we've got a difference there, and it's not a single line that repeats in this section. So when we talk about this line, it repeats here, and it was a river that I could not pass through because we're talking about going through the water. So the theme is the same, but there's a distinct difference. And instead of occurring once, it occurs twice here. But still the matchup is obvious. A river that could not be passed through. Then he led me back to the bank of the river. And the last line, these three, tells us the depth of the water. It was ankle deep, it was knee deep, it was waist deep, and here it was, for the water had risen, it was deep enough to swim in. So no longer can you stand or wade. You're gonna have to float or swim. So again, the pattern's a little bit different because it's doubled here in the fourth thing. So here we have the man measuring off 1,000 cubits. Now when it comes to distance from the Temple Mount and the temple at the center of time, we understand this. The distance measure equates to time. It's been proven. It can't be denied. The evidence is just too plain. And so here's a man measuring off distance from the Temple Mount. And what does that mean? We're talking about time, water as time. And so what's the measurement of the water that corresponds? Well, at the 1,000 cubit distance, it's ankle deep, then it's knee deep, then it's waist deep, and then it's too deep, can't stand in it, can't wade across it. So the time is increasing according to a pretty steady measure here, ankle, knee, waist, right? That's a pretty steady measure. And then it's not up to his shoulders. All of a sudden now it's, wow, it's gone deep right here. No more steady depth increase. Now it's gone to a whole new level. So with regard to the Shemitah, if we're counting off Shemitah, which we are, time, there's a steady progression of the continuity of time. And then all of a sudden you get to this fourth unit and wow, something's going on here. Yes, something is going on here. What is going on here? Wow. It was a river that I could not pass through. Okay, so let's talk about the visual on this. Because in verse 6, he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen this?" And what that is a prompt. That's a prompt. And it's not just a prompt for the Son of Man there, who is the witness. It's a prompt for us now. And this is what the Holy Spirit does in these prophetic passages when the Holy Spirit opens the revelation on it. Son of man, have you seen this? Visualize what's going on here. This is being mapped out in this ritual enactment of prophecy for us to understand. So Aaron and I, when we talked about this yesterday, his understanding of it was pretty much like mine had been. And there's a validity to that, and there's something else going on that the Lord was magnifying to me. So Aaron, you've been patiently listening to me go on and on and on. Please take an opportunity to talk about the man measuring 1,000 cubits and leading the witness through the water and how you visualized that in the past.
Right. Well, my initial understanding, as you said, was that this was representing a linear progression, that the angel was measuring out 1,000 with the man behind them walking in a straight line. So they'd measure 1,000, stop, and there the water would be ankle deep, measure out another 1,000, continuing in a straight line, stop, knee deep, and then another 1,000, stop, waist deep, and then measure another 1,000, and then the water was too much. So just a linear progression in a straight line away from the temple. That was my initial thinking and understanding of it.
And that's probably what I'd been thinking too. I hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought as to visualization, but it just I just kind of let it be what it seemed to be and didn't give it too much thought. But we're prompted very specifically to visualize what's going on here. And so in some language here, the word "ford" is used, like right here, and this is a legitimate translation. This is the NASB. And so when you ford, you cross from one side to the other. That's what fording is. And so what the Lord was impressing upon me, and I sketched it out, is that what they were doing was they're walking maybe in it, maybe alongside it. But when it says, and then led me through the water, so he measured 1,000 cubits and then led him through the water. So did he go back to where he was and then led him through the water to where he measured off the 1,000 cubits? I think they were probably on the bank and measuring off 1,000 cubits, and they were together. And then the agent led the witness, and they forded it. And that's what they were doing. Whether they went all the way across to the other side and back or just to the other side, I don't know. I don't think it matters, but they were fording it. So they're going in a transverse direction across the flow, because that's what fording is. And this matters because down here in the fourth thing, it says, then he led me back to the bank of the river. Now, if you have to be led back to the bank, you have to have left the bank at some point. That means you were on the bank. So at what point here were they on the bank if they just walked down the center of the stream? At no point. So I'm thinking it's important, have you seen this, to visualize what's going on here. They're fording. He measures 1,000 and then they're together from the beginning and all the way through. And he leads John the witness through the water, and it's ankle deep. And then maybe they get to the other side, or maybe they go out a little ways and come back to the same side. Don't see that as particularly important, or else we'd have more direction on that. But you see my point here. They're measuring off 1,000, and then they're going transverse to the flow. And it's ankle deep, knee deep, waist deep, all the way across. So they go and they return to the bank each time, because they have to start out at the bank to be led back to the bank. So at the 4,000, here they go, right? They're going off. They leave the bank. They're in the river. Now, don't know how big the angelic agent was. Might have been, 8-10 feet tall and able to stand. But this is not something he's walking across. So it doesn't say anything about them remaining stationary at that depth. Typically, when you're in a river, unless you're anchored somehow, you're going to go downstream, or you're going to be swimming to maintain your position. It doesn't say anything about what's going on there. It seems logical that they were maybe going downstream, and so they would come back to the bank of the river downstream from where they left. Now, we don't know that is exactly what happened. It might have been stationary in position. They might have remained at exactly 4,000 cubits. But it seems likely, because of the rest of the information that we get here, and because of the understanding that we have of what this prophesies about from many other examples, they were probably swept downstream and then maybe returned back to the same time. But you'll see why I'm going on about that in a moment. Because what we understand about the fourth is that it repeats. Remember this image here? We're in this one right here, and we don't have another Shemitah yet because we're still just in the first pass through the Shemitah. We're nearing the end of it. We've got another 3 months to go or so in 2019 before we get to Yom Teruah. And at that point, we start the next Shemitah, which is 861 from the beginning, and it's the fifth Shemitah in sequence from 1991. But something special is going to happen. Time will be reset into the past to the end of this third Shemitah, and so the fifth in sequence will actually begin at the same time the fourth began, and it will play out through the same calendar years, but it will be very different. It's not identical to the fourth. It is the fifth, but it's going to play out in the same time as the fourth. It's going to begin where the fourth did at the end of the third. And this is what we see exactly modeled for us right in here, and in two ways. And this is just fantastic. Really exciting. We've got it here once in this first block, and then it's repeated a second time. Not only is it repeated a second time, it's inverted. There's an inversion there. We're going back. This is a construction that's A, B, B prime, A prime. Technical language of the chiasm. So in this structure, what we have pictured basically is the two Shemitah here, embedded or encoded into the literal structure as kind of a secret message for us. And what's here at the pivot? The water had risen. The water as what? Aaron, as what?
That would be time, sir.
Time. A time pivot? A doubling was a river that I could not pass through. Why can't we get through this? Why can't we get through this? Why? Because we're going to cross over once, and we're going to cross over again. And it requires coming back to the bank of the river at the 4,000 measure, right? Which is, again, basically what we've got going here. There's a pivot at the end of the fourth. At the beginning of the fourth, we start anew. There's the 1,000 cubits per the language of Ezekiel 47, 2,000, 3,000, and then 4,000. And here we have a going out and back, repeating. This repetition is just beautiful. Pivoting on water is time. The water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in. Whoa. So now, in these, you're basically anchored to the bank, which, given the river of time, one bank represents the linear flow. And here, you're in the time stream. You're not anymore anchored. You're in the time stream, subject to whatever anchoring the Lord provides. And we know this structure is valid because, I mean, you can study it for yourself. This is what it is. It's not anything else. It is this. A river that could not be passed through. And here we have an extra insertion. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? So what is going on here? There's something going on here. And we know what it is. Then he led me back to the bank of the river. So have you seen this? Where are they? Well, they're out in the time stream. Whoa, no longer anchored to the bank. Whoa. Yeah, some kind of time mission going on there. Some kind of modeling. Yeah, this is in advance, a prophecy and a ritual that is going to be fulfilled. This was an essential ritual. And there's more insight about what's going on to be had a little in the rest of the context. But I mean, if you see what's going on there, then he led me back to the bank of the river. Yeah, where they started from. Yeah, like this. This is what it looks like. Okay. So that's really exciting. Aaron, do you have anything else you want to add before we talk about the trees on the bank?
You know, I'm glad you asked, because I think what came to mind will serve as a segue to that. You know, yesterday we were looking at that language there, a river that could not be passed through. And we were talking about, well, in the nature of this Shemitah and this extra season, it can't continue on. We can't get to where we need to get to in the biblical prophetic timeline if this time continues. We can't get there from here. So it cannot be passed through. So we have to go back to the bank to where this thing started in order for the biblical prophetic timeline to play out as it must. So that just speaks so loudly, and this is so very, very exciting.
Amen to that. Can't be passed through, and it's deep enough to swim in. So how are you going to get across? You're going to need some help here.
The word translation sure came to mind as we were talking about that yesterday.
Translation, teleportation, some kind of supernatural provision, because we're going to get from one side to the other. That's what's got to happen. The biblical timeline has to be restored. One of the things that is of particular interest to us here is this direction eastward, and that this is a temporal thing. And it has to do with not future time. This is ancient time, in ancient days, ancient mountains. It has to do with from of old, springing out from ancient times, days of old. From the beginnings of the earth, the beginning of his works. So this evokes the past. not the future. And so if we're moving in the eastward direction, which way is the current flowing? Into the past? Is this a time stream that's going into the future? It's coming from the past into the future. And so what's going on with resisting the flow or going along with the flow? And you have to see this in the context of there is a manipulation of time where with respect to a position on the bank, there is some resistance to the flow, or there's some kind of intervention going on with respect to the location on the bank, which is a position in time. And so again, that really speaks to me of supporting this model. And you know, over time I have sketched a number of ways that I thought that would be a good representation. And when I came upon this one, Aaron got really excited, and I was really excited about it. It's like, hey, yeah, that's the best visual representation yet, and it really has a lot to reveal. So I continue to refer to that, and it continues to speak more and more highly the more I learn about these biblical models. Go ahead, Aaron.
One other thing that came to mind rather strongly as we were looking at the chiastic structure and the inversion there in verses 5 and 6 was the same type of chiastic structure and inversion that we see in Revelation 10 with the bitter in the stomach, sweet in the mouth structure in that, and then which is mentioned to him before he's told to go back and prophesy again. And you know, looking at it here, and the angel tells him, take it and eat. He said, it will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth be sweet as honey. So I took the small scroll from the angel's hand and ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. And when I'd eaten it, my stomach turned bitter. So that same type of inversion before he went back to prophesy again. And we see that here with the inversion and the chiastic structure, and then he's led back to the bank of the river. So another exciting connection.
And again, one of the things that I just get a huge thrill over is the interruption here. And he said to me, son of man, have you seen this? Yeah. Wow. Okay. So only after that, when he's going back, after he went back, or as he went back, then it says, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on the one side and on the other. Where were the trees before? Why now? So we're going to talk about this a little bit, and then about where the rest of the chapter is going and how that relates to what comes before it. So in verse 7, it matches up here to verse 12. And on the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. And then in this next section, I've got a comment window prompt right there in that bar. So I click on it and bring up the note that says, compare the fruitfulness of the land and the sea, the leaves and the fruit of the trees, to the abundance and variety of the fish in the sea where the river goes. So we're going to do that. And the fishermen stand beside the sea, compared to on the banks of the river. So this section has 3 that repeat. And this corresponds to this part of verse 12. And in these 3 sections, they repeat in an A, B, A, B, A, B kind of pattern. It's an alternation. And he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, which is a desert, a dry desert, which is where it needs to be watered by time. It's a dry place, and this also has to do with resurrection. The dry and the wet. The dry is death, and the wet is resurrection. That's the symbol. It's a baptism allegory, and that's the metaphor. So the watering of the Arabah, and then it enters the sea. And the sea is many things. It's a place where the dead are, and the dead come out in resurrection. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And it doesn't usually happen that way. Usually the fresh water goes brackish. The fresh water goes to salt as the freshwater river goes into the sea. And the sea, the salt of the sea, during the tides, backs up into the mouth of the river. So the end of the river and the delta and what's going on there is all brackish. So this is something that's supernatural and miraculous. Wherever the river goes, in verse 9, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea. From Engedi to Eneglaim, it will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. And on the banks of both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. And so we see the continuity with this water that's issuing from below the threshold of the temple, around the gate facing east on the south side. So there's a continuity. I have a single bar spanning all that to represent that is a contextual block, a unit. So in this language here, if this sounds familiar with the trees on both sides of the river and the leaves being for healing and the bearing of fresh fruit every month, you're probably thinking, ooh, Revelation 22. And so you should. Aaron, would you read the first section here from the ESV?
Sure. Revelation 22, verse 1. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also, on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever.
Woohoo! Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Amen.
So that's what we're seeing in Ezekiel 47. And, this part about the trees and the leaves. So that's the future. And how are we going to get there? We're going to get to the future through this. We're going to get here in this block through this block. This is the way to get there in time from where we are or where we were to Revelation 22. That's exciting. You see what's going on there? There's a linear progression in time with a little interruption here.
And as you pointed that out, I made a note here as you were talking about it. We said previous times this season we're in, we're doomed. If this plays out like this, we're doomed. But it doesn't go on like this, because with the reset, we go from doomed to life when the biblical prophetic timeline is fixed. And that's what we're seeing with the trees and the life and the food and the fish. And it's exciting. So just from doomed to redemption and everything the way it's supposed to be with the Lord's ultimate victory. So that is exciting and definitely worth dancing about.
Oh, big time. And in the language here where the water flows, this is also the water of life. It's the living water. It's a resurrection. And the resurrection is evident here. Whenever you're talking about many fish, well, how many parables are there of the harvesters at the end of the age coming in with their nets? About John 21, where 153 fish are caught out of the net. Very significant. So this is the language here. Fishermen standing beside the sea. What are they doing? Well, aren't these the harvesters harvesting resurrection? From one perspective, absolutely. Fish being of many kinds. Think of 1 Corinthians 15 and the variations of the bodies, which are likened to the stars in the heavens. Star differing from star in glory. There's a kind of resemblance of the sun, which is the bridegroom. That'll be for the bride also. And then there's the kind that's of the moon. And then there's the kind that are of the stars, differing from each other in glory. Different kinds of flesh in the resurrection bodies. One version of which is fitted to the heavenlies, and another version of which is fitted to the earth. And here's a special provision in the rest of the chapter. So we got first 12 verses here, which is a time number, and then there's a transition in the 13th. So the mastery of time is on display here in the division of the verses, in the count of the verses, in the division of the chapter, which is not by random coincidence. The 12 here is linked to the 13 is linked to the 12 because it's based upon the 12 tribes of Israel. And what's the subject here? The boundary by which, and we're talking about boundaries and boundary crossings because this is about dimensions. This is space-time dimensions, heavenly dimensions and earthly dimensions, and the divisions between them. And we talk a lot about the crossing over into the promised land and what happened with Joshua and that space-time ritual, which was critical. The promised land is huge. And so here it's like under Joshua crossing the river Jordan at flood stage in that big miracle, which was a time-space ritual with the 12 stones, remember? And the memorial in Gilgal, which means stone circle. So here we have a division of the land for inheritance among the 12 tribes of Israel. And the structure here is an A-B comparison. So this shall be the boundary of the land, matches to this A section. And then this is the B, and then this part here, and continuing on in the chapter is the B prime, the details of the division that falls to their inheritance. And this is also the promised rest in Hebrews, book of Hebrews, that has not yet been brought to pass. So this is an exceedingly awesome, over-the-top passage of scripture about a rich prophetic tapestry about our time, the keystone pattern, the extended keystone pattern, the reset of time. What do you think, Aaron? Am I out of control here?
You could be even more excited. I think we could be up around dancing on camera, and I think it still wouldn't be enough. I mean, it is absolutely exciting. Definitely something to rejoice in, and you know, this is where our hope is, and it's exciting. So, yeah, dancing around, a fitting thing to be doing with this, for sure.
And there is language here where you have to recognize that this is a final Aliyah. This is an immigration of the tribes and all God's people, Israel, into their inheritance, which the land is their inheritance. This is their inheritance, the earth, the land. So we've talked a few times recently about Saul Kulik, who's an Israeli scientist who discovered a significant evidence of the end coming in 2019. And we haven't talked recently about the kind of evidence that he obtains. So I'm going to go into that just a little bit and liken that to what we see in Ezekiel 47. So Kullak discovered that major events affecting the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel can be numerically obtained by mathematical relation between two observable physical factors, the inclination of the planet and the latitude of the biblical borders in Israel. These are the kind of things that I've been talking about with the Olympic Park and the season of the establishment of the state of Israel. The latitude of the biblical borders in Israel is what he's going to, and he says that that is linked to the physics of the planet, the inclination of the planet, which is a space-time thing. So the Earth is continually mapping out the prophecy of Ezekiel 47, basically. This division of the Lord for all his inheritance. And these things are spectacular. I mean, God made his creation to manifest himself to us and truth of all kinds. He put his word in the heavens, in the configurations of the stars and planets. But this is not a fixed revelation. This is a changing revelation over time. In 1991, I was privileged to be a witness of the sign that came, signaling the Lord's return in judgment. It took a lot of years for me to get a handle on more detail about what that meant, but the Lord has been faithful. And so I have to imagine that Saul Kullak is going to be a little disappointed in his expectation about this season because he's on to something legitimate. And so this is another promise that will have seemed to fail. But when the biblical timeline is restored, well, it won't fail at all. It will manifest in the final Aliyah. Kullak gave several examples of the accuracy of the algorithm, demonstrating the proof of it, like Flynn demonstrated the precepts of the temple at the center of time. The first being the entrance of the Jews into Israel after the Exodus from Egypt, based on sources in the Bible and the Talmud, which we don't use the Talmud for obvious reasons. Kullak placed the Exodus from Egypt at 1476 BC, which is pretty close to Stephen Jones's assessment. This means that the children of Israel came into the land of Israel in 1436 BCE, which, according to my formula, correlates with the latitude of Jericho, their entry point into the land. So Stephen Jones's number also corresponds to the latitude of where they would have crossed over to Gilgal. They crossed over nearby Jericho into Gilgal. So Kullak's approach leads him to the consistent and accurate results. And if this applies to history past, it invites projection into history future. The future really is just history that hasn't happened yet, right? In God's perspective, past, present, future, he's everywhere, every when. He can distinguish between them, obviously. He oversees everything, but he can't make mistakes about projecting what's going on in the future because he's looking at it the same as he is the past. He's omniscient and omnipresent. So, but Kullak's formula is not limited to the past. The latitude of the southernmost point of the Arnon River, like a river of time, you could say, corresponds to next year. There we go. The results, this was from 2018. The results show the year before an Aliyah, immigration to Israel, literally ascending. Kullak said, this means that in 2 years there will be an Aliyah, which according to the calculations, so I guess that was 2017, because we're talking about 2019. According to the calculations, this will be the largest yet, since it is the most southern latitude of all the borders of Israel, biblical, which is how it's going to be, has not yet been, but is going to be. This is the final Aliyah, and there will be no more exiles. And this is not speculative. This has been demonstrated. This is a legitimate model. God has embedded this in creation. Kullak made one final comment on the nature of his formula. Since the formula bears accurate results based on the biblical borders of Israel, what is known as Greater Israel, the relevance of these borders is prophetic and still relevant today. And I got to know, he's going to be really disappointed. He's probably thinking, where is this final Aliyah? Maybe the Lord is working with him as he is with 144,000 in this season, in comparison, kind of in parallel to how the Lord is working with the bride in this season. We're very expectant about what's going to be going on. We came to a place in 2015 where we had to conclude that there's something missing here. There's something we clearly don't understand. We were getting mixed messages about the reality of our season. We couldn't understand how it is, but it isn't the final Shemitah. How can that be? And when the Lord brought insight about the reset of time, yeah, it was pretty mind-boggling. But if the context wasn't what it was, well, I don't know how we could have got our minds wrapped around it. I don't know how we could have accepted it. But the Lord prepared us in advance. He saw us through it, and he's, in more recent years, most particularly in 2018, when the Lord began to grant insight about the reset of time and the schedule of the reset of time, things really began to make more sense. And I have to talk about this model. If we didn't have that piece that has to do with the schedule of the reset of time, it could not be said that we would know in advance. And what's the point of the keystone pattern if the schedule of the reset of time isn't known? Just knowing that time is going to be reset, that this particular Shemitah is not valid, how would we know about the timing of things? Without that piece of the puzzle, like we see here, I've got them labeled here as 3A and 3B, the linking of the keystone. Can't read it behind that, but the reset of time is related to that. Without these two pieces, the connection here is not known, and so there is no point of beginning a count at this moment in time and then counting off. It's negated by a reset that has no definition that's clear in time. But when the schedule of the reset is known, understanding when it's coming and when we're going to be reset back to, that's the kind of detailed information we need to establish the prophecy and to be able to say with confidence and act upon a strategy that's legitimate. And so this is necessary, and I believe we've got it. Aaron and I, we're not trying to fool anybody. We're not trying to sell this. You'll buy it or not. Some people will see it, some people won't. Some people will adopt appropriate strategy, other people won't. But this has been a critical season. It's been essential, absolutely necessary in order to bring to pass everything that the Lord is bringing to pass. And from one perspective, what that's going to look like is this part right here that I'm highlighting again. Because you can't get there without this and this. And here, as they're leaving the temple, we're talking about 1991, the celestial sign. This is when he departs from the temple. This is a time marker that we understand as being this one right here, this line, celestial sign of 1991. That's the significance there. And so this season represented here is the Lord's return in judgment. And there are three parts that repeat: Shemitah 857, 858, 859. And then this one is doubled, Shemitah 860 and 861. There's an inversion. There's a reset of time where the water is flowing. And there's not an anchoring anymore. as there had been to the position on the bank. So we're going to be led back to the bank of the river. And to mark that out, for our special attention, we have this prompt. And he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen this?" And I hope you have, because it is glorious. Aaron, would you like to have a word?
Yes, please. The one thing that was really coming to mind there as you were going through the last portions and discussing the exciting news there with Saul Kulick was, promises fulfilled. We've seen so many seem to fall and fail in this season, but when things are corrected, promises will come to pass, all of them. And what the Lord was bringing to mind was in Jeremiah 31:36, the Lord declares, "If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me forever." And that's why the enemy's trying so hard to throw all the time and space off the rails and try to render the Lord's promises null and void. But that's not going to happen. It's going to be fixed, and all of the Lord's promises will come to pass, and the Lord's people will endure forever. So just wanted to put that out there, and so yeah, this is extremely exciting. So that's all I've got, buddy.
Awesome.